Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the weeds on Chinese espionage.
Yeah, it's a huge topic. We want to kind of unpack how their intelligence apparatus works, both inside China and, around the world.
We're drawing on a really detailed conversation with an international observer, someone with a lot of perspective.
Mm-hmm. Gives us a good foundation.
Exactly. And this isn't like your typical spy movie stuff. We're looking at the sheer scale, the reasons behind it, and frankly, how effective or sometimes ineffective it all is.
There are definitely some surprising angles to explore.
Absolutely. So where should we start? Maybe that core idea you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I think understanding the dual nature is key. They focus intensely inward on their own people and also outward on the rest of the world.
Okay, let's break down that internal focus first. What's driving all that domestic surveillance?
Well, fundamentally, it's about control. In a one-party system, keeping a lid on things is crucial. There's this constant worry about instability.
Like in Xinjiang, the source mentioned the Uyghurs.
Exactly. That's a prime example. You have an ethnic group, the Uyghurs, distinct from the Han majority,
right,
who are, 93% of the population?
Yeah.
And they're mostly Muslim.
Right. So that ethnic and religious difference makes Beijing nervous.
Very nervous.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, even though the state is officially atheist, they still control religion incredibly tightly. Think about the Dalai Lama's succession. The government wants control even there.
It really shows the extent of their desire for control.
And to maintain that control internally, you need a massive security force. The numbers are just, staggering.
How staggering are we talking?
The source estimates about 1 million people involved in intelligence and security in China.
1 million? Wow. How does that compare?
We'll put it this way. The U.S., across all its agencies, maybe 350,000. Russia, perhaps 250,000. India, tiny in comparison, 30,000. Brazil, even less, like 6,000.
So 1 million people, that's maybe 1 in every 70 or 75 adults in China, potentially?
Something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It just paints a picture of how comprehensive that internal watch needs to be, or how comprehensive they want it to be.
But does having that many people automatically mean it's, super effective intelligence? Or just widespread surveillance?
That's a really good question. Quantity versus quality, right? Something to keep in mind. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's look outward. A really unique factor is the huge Chinese diaspora.
Ah, yes, the communities all over the world. Malaysia, Indonesia.
Yes, significant percentages there, like 25% in Malaysia, 30% in Indonesia. Then big communities in Vietnam, the U.S., Argentina, loads of places.
So how does this global population fit into their intelligence strategy?
Well, it's sort of a double-edged sword for Beijing. The diaspora can be a source of intelligence for them, but it's also a target for their intelligence services.
Why did so many people leave China originally? The source touched on that history, didn't it?
It did. Mostly starting in the 19th century, people left looking for, a better life, economic opportunity. They often became merchants.
Kind of like the Jews of Asia comparison the source made, because they focused on trade.
Exactly. Similar historical patterns where land ownership might have been restricted, so trade became the path. But it wasn't always easy. They faced discrimination in many places.
Like in Malaysia, you mentioned. Social outcasts, legal limits.
Yeah, that kind of thing happened. So, given they're spread out globally, why does China feel the need to monitor them so closely?
Fear of outside influence. Opposition groups, maybe?
That's a big part of it. They worry about movements starting up abroad that could challenge the party back home. And there's a cultural layer, too,
Confucianism.
Right. The emphasis on social harmony, obedience, hierarchy, that's deeply ingrained. It makes the government very wary of anything that disrupts that harmony, even if it's happening outside China's borders.
And maybe Lao Tzu's ideas offer a contrast, but Confucianism is more dominant in this context.
Arguably, yes, in terms of state ideology and control. Plus, you can't forget the history of the Civil War, the split with Taiwan. That makes them extra sensitive to any perceived external threats or challenges to their legitimacy.
Gotcha. That historical context is definitely important. Okay, so turning to China's actual spying operations abroad. There's this idea, maybe more in the West, that Russia is the main intelligence threat, not China.
Yeah, that perception exists. But the source is pretty clear. Chinese operations targeting the U.S., for example, are very real, very active and ongoing. They just might not always make the same kinds of headlines.
So what kinds of operations are we talking about?
A mix. There's the classic military stuff, troop movements, weapons tech. But a huge focus for China, really crucial, is industrial espionage.
Stealing business secrets, technology, why is that so important for them? The source really hammered this point.
The argument is that it's often their main way, sometimes maybe the only way, to get certain advanced knowledge quickly.
The only way, that's a strong statement, is the idea that they don't innovate much themselves. I know some people would disagree with that.
It is a strong statement, and yes, it's debatable. The source suggests limitations in fundamental innovation, partly tied to the communist system itself.
How so?
Well, the idea is that the system tends to punish failure quite harshly. So taking big risks on truly groundbreaking, fundamental research might be discouraged. People might stick to safer, more incremental stuff.
So there's less incentive for those big leaps.
Possibly. The source used this term arismo, like a focus on immediate practical results rather than long-term deep research. Deng Xiaoping was maybe different in some areas, like infrastructure, taking a longer view.
Okay, so if fundamental innovation is harder, acquiring existing tech becomes the shortcut. How do they do it now?
A key method is using the overseas Chinese population, both for spotting opportunities and sometimes directly acquiring technology. The Thousand Talents program is a known example.
Right. Officially, it's about bringing talent back to China.
But in practice, it's been linked pretty strongly to government-backed efforts to get technology, sometimes illicitly.
The source had that wild story about the Danish telecom company, TDS, involving Ericsson and Huawei.
Yeah, that was quite something. Basically, TDS needed a new cellular system. Ericsson and Huawei were bidding. Huawei came in with this incredibly low bid.
Suspiciously low.
Very. It turned out someone inside Ericsson, a guy named Du Goldstein apparently, had leaked Ericsson's confidential bid information directly to Huawei.
Wow, so they knew exactly what price to beat.
Precisely. It shows industrial spying isn't just about, like, top-secret military plans. It's about gaining any commercial advantage at any level.
And just stealing plans isn't always enough, is it? The copied fighter jet example.
The J-29, yeah. That's a perfect illustration. They got the American blueprints, they built the plane, but
it didn't work?
Nope. Non-functional. Because having the plans isn't the same as having the deep knowledge, the manufacturing expertise, the material science, all the stuff that isn't written down.
The know-how.
Exactly. And some things are just incredibly hard to steal effectively. Think about the most advanced AI chips. China is lagging there, maybe 20, 25 years behind, according to the source. You can't just copy-paste that capability.
Okay, what about the classic sleeper agent trope, like in spy movies?
It happens, sure. There have been cases in Europe, but the source argues it's maybe harder for Chinese agents to blend in seamlessly in many Western countries compared to, say, Russian agents, just due to appearance. Think of the Americans TV show. Those agents could pass easily.
But aren't there still concerns? Port cranes in Germany with hidden cameras, TikTok?
Oh, absolutely. Distrust is growing because of numerous cases. Those cranes, the ongoing EU investigation into TikTok data potentially going to China, it makes covert operations harder as scrutiny increases.
Let's talk about that data collection. TikTok, other apps. Why gather so much personal information on such a massive scale?
The potential for blackmail, coercion, influence. That's a major driver. Imagine the sensitive stuff people share or search for online if a government gets access.
They could pressure individuals.
Potentially, yes. Use embarrassing info, financial details, whatever they find to make someone cooperate. This source mentioned a hypothetical TikTok scenario, but also a real case involving Israelis spying for Iran using compromised data. It shows the principle.
So who's running this whole show? Is there one main spy agency?
The main one is the MSS, the Ministry of State Security, but you also have parts of the Communist Party, the military, PLA, all involved in intelligence.
So like the CIA, FBI, NSA in the U.S., lots of agencies.
Kind of, but the difference is, in China, they all ultimately report to the same central leadership. So it's arguably more monolithic, maybe less prone to the kind of intense interagency rivalries you sometimes see in the U.S., though there's likely still internal competition, of course.
Interesting. Now, there's this stereotype about the Chinese being incredibly patient, playing the long game. Does the source agree with that?
Actually, no. It kind of challenges that idea. It suggests they aren't necessarily more patient than, say, the Japanese or Koreans.
Yeah.
Maybe even less patient than Israelis, surprisingly.
Really? So not playing the super long game all the time?
Perhaps not in the way we often assume. This relative impatience could influence their intelligence approach, maybe favoring quicker wins over decades-long infiltration plans.
That definitely flips the common narrative.
Yeah.
Okay, shifting to government-level stuff. Any examples of China trying to directly influence foreign governments?
The source mentioned a case in the U.S., an unnamed Chinese woman who apparently got quite close to U.S. politicians, influencing them. Similar things have been seen with Russian operations.
And just the sheer size, that million-person apparatus we talked about, gives them huge potential for influence operations, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And think about the pressure within their own system. High-level officials, CEOs, even generals disappearing. It shows the consequences of stepping out of line, which likely makes intelligence officers very cautious, but also very focused on delivering what leadership wants.
The source also brought up a cultural point about lying or deception.
Yeah, it's suggested that in some contexts within Chinese culture, being untruthful isn't seen as inherently problematic in the same way it might be in the West. It can be seen as strategic.
Which must make it incredibly difficult for foreign agencies to figure out what's true and what isn't.
Adds another layer of complexity, definitely.
Okay, back to technology. TikTok and Huawei. We hear about these constantly. Why all the anxiety, especially from governments like the U.S.?
It comes down to the vast amount of data these platforms and devices collect, and the potential for the Chinese government to access it.
Even if there's no smoking gun, legally speaking.
Often, yeah. Getting concrete proof that satisfies a court is hard. But the suspicion is strong, based on China's laws and past behavior. It's seen as too big a risk. And it's not just apps. The source mentioned that Chinese base down in Argentina in Neuquén. That raises eyebrows too.
Right. But collecting data is one thing. Using it effectively is another. How good is China at the analysis part?
That seems to be a key bottleneck. They can hoover up enormous amounts of information, but processing it, analyzing it, turning it into actionable intelligence, that's harder. Partly it's computing power. They need really advanced AI, and they're still behind on producing the top-end chips needed for that. The source used a great analogy, like having a full hard drive but a really slow computer.
So data overload without the processing power.
Something like that, potentially limiting their effectiveness despite the scale of collection.
And this isn't just a U.S. problem, is it? Where else are they active?
Oh, everywhere. Taiwan is obviously a huge target, constant infiltration attempts. Europe, too, especially countries with big Chinese communities like Germany.
And Western agencies struggle to keep up.
Well, they often have limited resources and other urgent threats, terrorism, Russia, etc. Countering persistent, widespread Chinese espionage takes a lot of effort. And that fear of failure culture within the Chinese system might also make their own agents less willing to take risks, potentially hindering effectiveness.
What about spying in places like Russia or India? Is it different there?
They do operate there, but the methods might adapt. In India, the source suggested, with a smaller diaspora, they might rely more on things like bribery, or cultivating sources the old-fashioned way.
And influence ops through media, that was mentioned too.
Yeah, allegations of paying for favorable coverage, inserting supplements like China Daily into other papers, maybe leaning on outlets. The source mentioned potential examples like the South China Morning Post, Nike Asia, even a controversial editorial in The Economist regarding Taiwan. It's about shaping the narrative.
Okay, one last big area. Universities. How deep does the infiltration go there?
According to the source, it's pretty significant in U.S. universities, especially in fields studying China's sinology departments.
Have there been arrests?
Yes, people have been arrested in research fields for passing sensitive information. It's a real concern.
And China might be sending fewer students to the U.S. now.
That's what the source suggested, yeah. A potential strategic shift, which could mean fewer intelligence opportunities in the U.S. university system, but maybe those students and the focus shifts elsewhere, Europe, perhaps.
Which leads to debates about restricting student visas.
Exactly. It's a tricky balance.
Yeah.
And identifying actual spies is incredibly hard anyway, especially with encrypted communications everywhere.
Which brings us to the really complex issue of American citizens of Chinese descent. How do agencies handle that?
It's incredibly sensitive. Officially, you can't investigate based on ethnicity alone, but suspicions can arise. There's a need to avoid prejudice, uphold rights, but also address security concerns. The source noted a difference often perceived between first-generation immigrants and later generations ABCs, American-born Chinese.
And ABCs might even be treated differently if they go to China.
Some report that, yes. It's complex.
Wow. Okay, this has been incredibly insightful. It feels like we've landed on a kind of paradox here.
I think so. On one hand, China has this immense capacity for collecting data, this huge apparatus. On the other hand, they seem to face real limits in processing that data effectively, plus systemic issues related to, risk-taking and innovation within their intelligence culture.
So a massive machine, but maybe not as efficient or sophisticated in using the information as its size suggests.
That seems to be the picture emerging from the source, yes.
All right, so as we wrap up, maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Given what we heard about China's potential impatience, that drive for perhaps more immediate results, how does that factor into their long-term goals and the spy games they play? Is that impatience ultimately a strength, getting them quick wins, or could it be a major weakness in the long, complex game of global intelligence?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How does that impatience shape their strategy?
Definitely something to think about. And hey, if this whole world of intelligence, technology, and global power dynamics fascinates you, you might want to check out our other project. It's a podcast looking at AI and finance, featuring Claudio Suchovicki.
Yeah, a lot of these themes, tech competition, data, strategic thinking, come up there too, just in a different context. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts, usually out on Fridays.
So thanks for joining us for this deep dive today. We hope it gave you some new ways to think about the really complicated reality of Chinese espionage.